On to the fourth layer, the layer of beliefs and convictions, culture and religion. Before I give you one or two examples, this is the layer where in a singular person, you would talk about self-image and ego. And if you multiply that, you get world view. And of course, with the different cultures, you can actually have culture shock. All right, some examples. A personal example first. When I was about 23, I had a girlfriend, and when she found out that my parents, I'm an expat kid, so my parents lived in Tanzania at the time. When she found that out, she was very happy, and she was like, "Yes, let's go to Tanzania for vacation." And as we started to explore that, I became very aware that she'd had a very standard education for people of her age, and a pretty good education, but it was also very much clouded with what we would call leftist progressive ideas. And some of these leftist and progressive ideas, like we're going to have to save the world, are in a stark contrast to my experience as an expat kid being a minority in all these different countries. So as we went to Tanzania, and she was exposed, as I was of course, to how people can have completely different values and norms and attitudes than what we are used to, or we were used to, in that year in the Netherlands. Differences in, do you lie, do you not lie, how do you handle yourself, how do you show yourself. In Tanzania, of course, people also, like in India, have a very different from a Western way of comporting themselves. For her, it was culture shock. For me, it was rather normal, but it was just an example of how her worldview really needed to be changed to meet the real world, and that's that. Another example that I want to talk about is an example that a lot of people in Europe know, especially if they're a little older. In the Second World War, we've had this horrible experience where the Jews got persecuted. At a certain point, we started to call that the Holocaust, but that is, after the fact, when historians started to call it a Holocaust. Of course, a horrendous experience where lots of Jews got killed, and of course a number of other minorities. After the war, the Dutch people, talking to the German people, would often ask them, how is this possible? How is it possible you didn't know this? You didn't know that this was happening, the extermination of the Jews? And then we usually got an answer back, which was, ich habe es nicht gewusst, or wir haben es nicht gewusst, which means, I didn't know. Now, for us, and especially for us, so many years later, that seems completely inconceivable, a lie. But it may have been an open secret or public secret, and it may have been wishful thinking or willful blindness, willful ignorance. Either way, after the war, we had a hard time understanding the Germans, how they got into it. And of course, that's very judgmental, but that is how it was. And we failed to recognize that during the time before the Second World War, the Germans had bought hook, line, and sinker the worldview that Hitler and his propaganda minister, like Goering, had painted on how the world was. So For the Germans, they had actually bought a particular um, view of the world. And with hindsight, of course, we can say that that's not okay. And it was, of course, horrendous. The, the thing is that a lot of people in Europe actually remember that one sentence. I didn't see it. I didn't know, which, of course, like I already said, seems kind of ludicrous. In this fourth layer, the layer of beliefs and convictions, you also encounter attitude. A lot of people will have been told somewhere in their life that they have an attitude. Now, what does that mean? Attitude means that you have a way of approaching people, and there's something negative to be said about that, and it usually also implies that you aren't very conscious of your own approach. You're not conscious about the way you're treating other people. So attitude is usually seen as negative. What I want to stress right now is that we have to look at from where does this judgment or this approach of other people come? From where does it come? From where does it stem? And of course, once you know that, you can actually start to remove it. Now, the last example I wanted to touch on is the example of the Romans and the Germans in the beginning of the calendar. You know, the birth of Christ heralded the entrance of Christianity, and around that time we had the Romans and the Germans. And in the Romans and their civilization, there were a number of things that are really different from our civilization. And only upon looking at them do we see how our society is. At the time, abortion was very common, as was infanticide. Abortion of a lot of kids, and especially of girls. Now, also around that time, babies were not even people until they grew up. The love that we know is a concept that entered because of Christianity, as is caring for the weak and seeing everybody as being of equal value in essence. Did you know that compassion was not a common thing at the time of the Romans? That is a Christian value for you. Did you also know that the gladiators, that is, killing for sport, was stopped by a Christian emperor, Constantine? Um, this meant that at the time, society was about survival of the fittest and the law of the jungle. If you were weak, it was normal to take advantage of the people who are weak. The ideas that we have right now are something we're born into. And as we're born into our own society, we don't see clearly all the beautiful things that we have right now. There are, of course, a number of values and norms on how to deal with each other. The fact that we respect each other, a man and a woman, and we respect each other equally, of course, at the start, is something that is due to Christianity. And back in the Roman time, it completely was not that way. It was the other way around. If you were not a Roman, you were treated as lesser. If you were a woman, you were lesser. Slavery was there, and slavery was very common. The idea, what I just said, is the idea that we're born into a culture makes us blind to all the beautiful and important values in our own culture. We think of it as commonplace, and unfortunately it's not. And the values that we hold dear or that we find to be self-evident are not self-evident. Slavery was abolished in 18 1830 to 1880 in different countries. And although we did that in Northwestern Europe and America, and a lot of other cultures did not abolish slavery that quickly or that easily or willingly. Saudi Arabia did not abolish it until into the 1960s. More extreme examples are Mauritania. And in parts of Africa, slavery is actually coming back. Right now, there are slave markets in Libya. So what we hold to be self-evident, no slavery, equality, is not by definition self-evident. It's a product of our civilization. Now, that sums up the introduction to looking at the different layers of the glasses, and the last layer is the layer about culture, beliefs, and convictions, and it's also the trickiest layer. The trickiest because it's not self-evident, and I'll be talking about some of the things that are not self-evident in future videos. What I'm also going to be talking about is how do we remove these glasses? How do we prevent ourselves from having the glasses or the colored view at the world? How do we actually see the world as it is? So as we've talked about the different layers of the glasses, I hope it becomes self-evident that trying to remove the glasses would actually be best for all of us. As we remove the glasses layer by layer, we start to see the world more sharply, more acutely, and more as it is. Thank you for watching, and as always, of course, please like, subscribe, and donate me a cup of coffee if you find that this adds some value. Thank you.